Montana Territory, autumn 1887. Nobody in the valley noticed what was taking shape beneath Samuel Garrett's barn. From the outside, it appeared no different than any other weathered homestead structure scattered across the harsh western frontier. Rough-hewn timber, a sloped shingle roof patched with tar paper, and heavy bales of dried hay stacked high against the northern wall to block the biting wind. To any traveler riding past, Samuel looked like just another hard-scrabble farmer, desperately preparing his family for another brutal northern Rockies winter. But underneath that ordinary wooden barn floor, something extraordinary was taking form. While his neighbors spent every waking hour stockpiling cord after cord of mountain pine, while they chinked every tiny gap in their log cabin walls with wet moss and red clay, and while they prepared to battle winter the exact same way their fathers and grandfathers had before them, Samuel Garrett was digging. And the people of the valley thought he had completely lost his mind. Truth be told, if you want to discover practical, time-tested survival techniques every single week that actually saved lives when the world was harsh and unforgiving, hit that subscribe button for our channel right now. And drop a comment below, letting me know where you are watching from today. I personally read every single comment, and seeing how far our community reaches means the world to us. Because what unfolded in that Montana valley during the frozen winter of 1887 would forever change how those homesteaders thought about warmth, shelter, and the very ground beneath their boots. The question among the neighbors was never whether Samuel Garrett was crazy. The local builders, the storekeepers, and the veteran trappers all agreed he was out of his head. The real question was, what did this quiet former miner understand about thermal physics and winter survival that everyone else had completely missed? Make no mistake, this was not some wild experiment born from a sudden fit of panic or desperation. Samuel Garrett was a 42-year-old former copper miner who had spent a full decade working the deep underground shafts in Butte, Montana. He knew what hard labor was. Day after day, he had worked long, grueling shifts in subterranean tunnels that stretched hundreds of feet deep into the dark mountain rock. And down there, far beneath the frozen crust of the earth, he had noticed a simple, natural reality that every miner took for granted, but almost no one ever stopped to analyze. The rock temperature underground never changed. Summer or winter, scorching July afternoon or frozen January night, the bare rock face hundreds of feet below the surface stayed cool, steady, and constant. It was never cold enough to freeze water, and never warm enough to make a working man sweat. It was just perfectly baseline. While other miners saw those shafts merely as dark, brutal prisons of labor to escape from at the end of the day, Samuel viewed them as an extraordinary classroom. He studied how earth and rock insulate heat. He observed how depth creates thermal stability, and how the planet itself maintains an internal baseline temperature that remains entirely untouched by whatever blizzard or heat wave happens to be raging up on the surface. When Samuel finally saved enough money to leave the copper mines, bought his homestead claim, and began raising his young family in a valley where winter routinely killed cattle and sickened children, that underground knowledge never left his mind. It sat in the back of his memory, waiting for the year that forced him to put it to the test. That year arrived when his youngest son nearly died before the spring thaw. Samuel was not a man who sought the spotlight. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent his youth underground. He had purchased his 300-acre claim 3 years prior, building what most folks considered a respectable homestead. His wife, Margaret, managed their home and cared for their 3 children, Elizabeth, who was 9, William, 7, and little James, who had just turned 4. Their log cabin was sturdy by frontier standards. It was constructed from thick pine logs, built upon a heavy stone foundation, featuring a handcrafted fieldstone chimney that Samuel had labored over for weeks. By the standards of 1887 Montana, it was a fine home. But on the northern frontier, respectable did not mean warm. Every winter told the exact same terrifying story. When December arrived, temperatures would routinely plunge to 20, 30, and sometimes 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The gale-force wind that screamed down from the mountain passes did not merely blow past a cabin. It hunted. It searched relentlessly for every minute crack, every shrunken log seam, every microscopic flaw in a structure's insulation. Wood was the only fuel that kept a family alive, and cutting it was an endless, bone-chilling ordeal. The nearest stands of suitable timber were 3 miles uphill from Samuel's claim. He would spend 2 full days swinging a heavy double-bitted axe, and another full day hauling timber back to the homestead with a horse-drawn wagon. A standard homestead cabin needed 12 to 15 cords of hard pine to survive from late autumn to early spring. The cabin devoured wood like a monster. The iron firebox required constant feeding every 4 hours, and when the midnight mountain storms hit, someone had to stoke the coals every 2 hours just to keep the water in the indoor buckets from freezing solid. By 4 in the morning, the fire would die down to embers, and by dawn, thick sheets of ice would form on the inside face of the glass window panes. The 3 children slept together in a single small bedroom, huddled under every wool quilt and heavy bear hide the Garrett family owned. Margaret would heat heavy flat stones in the hearth fire before bedtime, wrap them tightly in thick flannel cloths, and tuck them under the blankets around the children's feet. But by 2 in the morning, those stones would turn as cold as iron. During the previous winter, little James had fallen gravely ill twice. He suffered from a deep, wet chest cough that lingered for weeks, accompanied by shallow, labored breathing that kept Margaret awake in tears through the freezing dark hours before dawn. When the country doctor from Helena finally made it out to their cabin after a 3-day storm delay, he checked the boy's chest, looked at the frost clinging to the bedroom walls, and offered a plain, brutal truth. "It is the cold, Mr. Garrett. It weakens their little lungs. If he catches another frost like this next winter, he might not make it through to April." Samuel had stood inside his cold barn that following spring, watching his own breath fog in the crisp April air, and made a firm, quiet promise to his family. He had spent 10 years working deep beneath the mountain stone. He knew a physical truth that standard timber builders remained blind to. The ground holds heat. 6 feet below the frozen snow line, the bedrock and dirt maintained a constant temperature, never freezing, never hot. Right around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit every single day of the year, while a wooden cabin built above ground was forced to constantly fight against a 30-degree below-zero blizzard, trying to bridge an agonizing 70 or 80-degree temperature gap. The deep earth ignored the Sation blizzard entirely. That summer, while his neighbors spent their weekends repairing woodsheds and cutting extra timber, Samuel started digging directly beneath his barn floor. He did not announce his project to the valley, he did not ask for advice from the town carpenters, nor did he seek permission from men who would have dismissed him as foolish. He simply grabbed his pickaxe and shovel and went to work. Every morning, as soon as the livestock chores were finished, Samuel disappeared into the dark interior of his barn with a mining pick, a spade, and a heavy wooden bucket. Margaret would bring him a tin cup of cold spring water at noon, peer down into the darkening hole, and ask how the dirt was moving. Samuel would wipe the sweat from his forehead, offer a short nod, and keep digging. The children knew their father was working on something unusual beneath the barn planks, but on a frontier homestead, children learned early not to ask unnecessary questions. In a place where survival was measured in cords of firewood and canned mason jars, every father had his projects. What Samuel was engineering beneath that barn floor was not merely a hole in the dirt. It was a masterclass in natural physics that most timber builders never understood. Heat rises. Every child on the frontier knew that simple rule. Cold air sinks. That was equally obvious. But what most homesteaders failed to realize was that the earth, just 6 feet below the frost line, operates in an entirely different thermal universe. The deep soil does not care about mountain gales. It does not respond to wind chill factors. The surface dirt above might be frozen solid at 30 degrees below zero, but 6 feet down, the earth maintains its steady baseline of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Always. It is the planet's internal thermal floor, created by the incredibly slow transfer of heat from deep within the earth, insulated by massive layers of packed soil and stone that absorb and release heat so slowly that seasonal changes become practically irrelevant. Samuel had lived in that underground thermal stability for 10 long years in the Butte mines. Now, he was going to place his wife and children right in the middle of it. His choice of location was meticulous. Samuel picked the barn floor for three specific reasons. First, the barn structure was already built, providing a massive wooden roof directly over his head to keep the rain and summer sun off his back while he excavated. Second, the barn sat on a natural elevation higher than the cabin, which meant surface water runoff would naturally drain away from the dig site rather than pooling inside. Third, and most importantly, for a man building something unorthodox, nobody paid attention to what a farmer was doing inside his own barn. He broke ground in early June, as soon as the spring mud dried enough to work. The overall structural plan was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. He required a subterranean chamber, measuring 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet deep. The thick timber floor of the barn would serve as the structural roof overhead. Entry to the chamber would be gained through a hidden heavy trapdoor built flush into the barn flooring, completely concealed under stacked bales of wheat straw. Ventilation was critical. He designed a dedicated air shaft hidden inside the hollow wall framing of the barn, venting to the exterior through what appeared to be nothing more than a weathered knothole in the outer siding planks. The manual excavation was familiar, painstaking work. Pickaxe, shovel, bucket. To keep his project discreet, Samuel hauled the heavy clay and rock out at dusk, spreading the freshly dug dirt evenly across his far pasture, where the summer grass quickly covered it. Every blow of his pickaxe took him deeper into the stable thermal zone. By mid-July, moisture was the enemy of underground living. Damp dirt would leach warmth and turn the chamber into a muddy cellar. So, Samuel lined every wall with heavy fieldstone, hand-selecting granite and limestone boulders he hauled from his own creek beds. Each stone was chosen for flat edges, carefully fitted, and dry stacked with a wet clay mortar mix. The stone walls needed to breathe just enough to prevent trapped condensation, while remaining tight enough to retain heat. Along the north and west walls, the specific sides facing the fiercest winter winds above ground, Samuel laid an extra layer of masonry, making those walls 18 inches thick instead of 12. The floor design was even more critical. He could not simply lay planks over bare damp earth. Cold and dampness would seep straight up through boots and bedrolls. To solve this, Samuel excavated an extra 12 inches below his target floor level, laying down an 8-inch bed of coarse river gravel for subfloor drainage. Over the gravel, he packed 4 inches of dry, coarse sand, and finally set massive, flat slabs of smooth limestone tightly together across the entire floor. This was thermal mass engineering at its finest. It was the exact same principle he had observed in the copper mines. Heavy stone absorbs ambient heat slowly, holds onto it for hours, and radiates it back into the surrounding air long after the heat source is extinguished. The ceiling was formed by the barn's existing floor joists, but Samuel reinforced the structure dramatically. He installed heavy pine support posts along the chamber perimeter, doubled the floor joists to handle massive overhead loads, and installed double-thick tongue-and-groove pine planks above. Between those heavy floor joists, he packed a dense 8-inch layer of dry clay, straw, and hardwood sawdust, creating an airtight, highly insulated ceiling barrier that prevented any heat from escaping upward into the cold barn. Ventilation remained his greatest mechanical challenge. Human beings generate moisture and consume oxygen. Without fresh air, an underground space quickly becomes damp, stale, and hazardous. But if he opened a large vent, the freezing outside air would flood the chamber and ruin the entire thermal effect. Samuel built a 4-inch diameter wooden intake pipe that ran up through the interior wall of the barn, pulling fresh air from near the roofline. At the base of the pipe, inside his underground room, he hand-forged a small iron damper valve that allowed him to control the airflow with precision. For heating, he did not need a massive iron stove. He constructed a small brick fire pit in the middle of the limestone floor, measuring just 2 feet across, lined with high-density fire bricks he had traded for in Helena. But instead of running a standard stovepipe straight up into the sky, Samuel designed a buried horizontal flue pipe. The metal flue pipe ran horizontally beneath the floor planks for 8 full feet before turning upward to vent behind the barn. This meant that every bit of hot smoke traveling down the pipe was forced to pass through 8 feet of buried stone mass before exiting the building. The heat from the smoke, which normally escaped uselessly out a traditional vertical chimney, was completely absorbed by the floor stones, transforming the ground itself into a massive thermal radiator. The entire system functioned on one beautiful principle of physics: leverage the Earth's natural baseline temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit, add a tiny amount of supplemental heat from a handful of wood twigs, and let the stone thermal mass retain that warmth for 24 hours. Instead of trying to force a frozen log cabin from -20 degrees up to 65 degrees, a brutal 85-degree battle against the mountain storm, Samuel was merely lifting his underground chamber from 55 degrees up to 65 degrees. A tiny 10-degree shift that required a fraction of the fuel. By late August, he began testing the air movement. He burned damp pine needles in the small central pit, generating dense white smoke. He watched the smoke draw smoothly through the horizontal flue without backdrafting a single wisp into the room. He adjusted the ventilation damper, watching the draft clear the air in minutes, while keeping the ambient room temperature completely stable. In September, he tested the drainage during a 3-day autumn downpour. He sat in the quiet chamber, listening to the rain hammer. The barn roof overhead. The stone walls remained completely dry, and the gravel drainage bed underneath carried away every drop of subsurface moisture. By October, the structure was ready. Samuel moved down a heavy wooden table, 4 sturdy chairs, wall shelves for oil lamps and dry provisions, and comfortable wool-stuffed sleeping pallets. From above ground, the entire setup was totally invisible. The heavy trapdoor was buried beneath a foot of loose hay straw. The ventilation exhaust looked like a harmless knothole in the exterior siding. Even the low flue pipe behind the barn was hidden behind a stack of weathered fence rails. Samuel had built a shelter that existed entirely outside the reach of winter, hidden in plain sight beneath his barn floor. When he finally showed his completed chamber to his nearest neighbor, Caleb Drummond, late one autumn afternoon, Caleb stepped back, stared at Samuel, and shook his head in absolute disbelief. "You dug a hole under your own barn, Sam?" Caleb asked, his voice laced with concern. "Are you out of your mind? You're going to bring the whole barn roof right down on your head and freeze your family to death in a damp cellar." Word spread across the valley fast. It started as quiet chuckles at the local blacksmith shop, then grew into loud banter over the counters at the Helena supply store. "Did you hear about Garrett? Gone and dug himself a groundhog hole under his barn floor. Says he's going to live down there with his kids this winter." The local builders were the most critical. Robert Finch, a veteran carpenter who had constructed 17 traditional log structures across the territory, stopped by the Garrett homestead in late October to return a borrowed crosscut saw. When Samuel lifted the heavy trapdoor and explained the thermal principles behind the chamber, the 55-degree subterranean baseline, the thermal mass of limestone, the buried flue, Finch listened with the cold, condescending smile of a man who believed he knew everything there was to know about frontier shelter. "Sam," Finch said flatly, patting the cabin's exterior pine logs, "I have built houses across this mountain territory for 20 years. God put timber above ground so men could build houses above ground. You put your family down in a hole in the dirt, and you are begging for rot, cave-ins, and damp lung rot. You cannot beat a Montana winter with a dirt pit." Others were far less polite. Henry Walsh, who ran the general store in town, cracked a joke that echoed across the settlement for weeks. "Garrett is just saving the undertaker a step. He's digging his family's grave before the blizzard does it for him." Even Margaret had her quiet doubts. She trusted her husband deeply, but she could see the judgment in the eyes of the women at church every Sunday morning. Older women, like Mrs. Henley, who had survived 40 winters on the frontier, pulled Margaret aside after service one morning, holding her hands tightly. "Your Samuel is a hard-working man, child, but men get crazy ideas when the solitude hits them. Don't let his pride put those sweet little children in a cold, damp hole." Margaret said nothing in reply. How could she explain to them what she had felt with her own hands? Earlier that week, during the first bitter frost of November, Samuel had taken Margaret down into the underground room at midnight. Outside, the wind was howling, and the cabin temperature had dropped to 48 degrees Fahrenheit despite a roaring fire in the hearth. But down beneath the barn, with no fire burning in the central pit at all, the thermometer hung on the stone wall read a steady, comfortable 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone floor felt warm through her wool socks. The air was dry, still, and completely draft-free. Margaret had looked at the red fluid in the glass thermometer tube, looked at her husband's calm face, and simply nodded. She did not care what the valley carpenters said. She cared about her children's lungs. The rest of the valley, however, remained convinced that Samuel Garrett was heading for a disaster. As November turned into December, and the dark autumn clouds rolled down from the northern peaks carrying the first true Arctic blizzard of the year, the settlers settled into their drafty log cabins, stoked their massive iron stoves, and waited for Samuel Garrett to learn his lesson the hard way. December of 1887 arrived across the Montana Territory with a quiet, lethal precision. It did not ease into the season. It slammed down like an iron gate. By the second week of the month, the mercury in the glass thermometer mounted outside Samuel Garrett's cabin door dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at dawn. By the third week, it plunged to 25 below 0. But as every experienced frontiersman knew, the raw temperature was only half the battle. The true killer was the relentless mountain wind. It roared down from the high peaks like a living, ravenous beast, howling night and day, without a single minute of relief. It slammed against the wooden homesteads across the valley, driving freezing air through the smallest log seams, pushing the frost through mud chinking and turning standard log cabins into wooden iceboxes. Up and down the valley, the traditional timber homesteads began to suffer severely. Firewood that families had labored all summer to cut, haul, and split was being consumed at terrifying speed. Chimneys that had drawn perfectly fine in milder autumn weather began backdrafting under the intense wind pressure, filling cabin living rooms with thick, suffocating pine smoke. Caleb Drummond, Samuel's nearest neighbor to the east, was burning through his winter wood supply at more than twice his normal annual rate. By mid-December, Caleb's wife had been forced to abandon the family's bedrooms entirely, moving their 4 young children into the small kitchen area, the only room in their log cabin they could keep even remotely warm. Yet even there, with their cast-iron cook stove burning red-hot day and night, the indoor room temperature hovered miserably in the low 40s. The Drummond children sat at the dinner table, wearing their heavy wool winter coats, thick mittens, and fur caps. Every single night, water left in the wash basin on the kitchen counter froze solid into a thick block of ice. 3 miles south, the Patterson family ran out of dry, seasoned pine timber entirely before Christmas Day had even arrived. Out of sheer desperation, Mr. Patterson was forced to trudge out into the deep snowdrifts to cut down green living timber. Burning green wood was an absolute nightmare. It produced very little heat, generated massive clouds of stinging black smoke, and coated the inside of their stovepipe with dangerous layers of sticky black creosote. By Christmas Eve, their youngest daughter had developed a deep, rattling cough that sounded identically like the respiratory illness that had nearly taken little James Garrett the year before. Even Robert Finch, the master builder who had arrogantly declared that human beings belonged above ground in timber houses, suffered a humiliating disaster on December 18th. A heavy buildup of creosote inside his main stone chimney caught fire during a midnight gale, cracking his mortared firebox and filling his home with blinding smoke. Finch and his terrified wife were forced to evacuate their cabin in 30-degree below 0 weather, running through snowdrifts to take emergency shelter at a neighbor's homestead, while he spent 2 days rebuilding his chimney in weather so cold that his mortar froze before it could even set. The entire valley was locked in a brutal war of attrition against the northern winter, and winter was winning on every front. But at the Garrett homestead, under the weathered floorboards of Samuel's ordinary barn, an entirely different reality was taking place. Samuel had moved his wife and 3 children down into the subterranean stone chamber during the first week of December. He did not do it out of sudden emergency. Their log cabin above ground was still standing intact, but because he was determined to test his thermal engineering design under maximum real-world stress, and because he refused to let his young children suffer through another drafty season, their daily living routine underground was remarkably simple. In the morning, Samuel would climb down the wooden ladder from the trapdoor, carrying a small armful of dry pine kindling. He would light a small, modest fire in the central fire pit, not a roaring, wood-devouring blaze like the ones burning above ground, but just a controlled flame, sufficient to lift the chamber's natural baseline temperature from 54 degrees Fahrenheit up to a comfortable 62 or 64 degrees. Throughout the entire day, Margaret would toss a small wooden split onto the embers every hour or two. At night, before blowing out the oil lamps, they simply let the fire die down to coals. The underground chamber retained heat with an efficiency that exceeded even Samuel's highest calculations. The heavy fieldstone walls, warmed gradually by the central pit, and backed by the massive, endless 55-degree thermal floor of the deep earth, radiated steady heat inward long after the last embers went dark. The flat limestone floor slabs remained warm beneath their feet. The heavily insulated ceiling packed with clay, straw, and sawdust prevented precious warm air from escaping upward into the cold barn rafters. And because the floor of the room sat well below the territory's deepest frost line, the surrounding earth never froze. It remained locked at that constant, reliable 50-degree thermal baseline that required so little fuel to maintain. By Christmas, the math didn't lie. While his neighbors were burning through 2 full cords of timber a month just to keep their kitchens above freezing, Samuel was consuming less than 1/3 of a single cord. Inside the chamber, the Garrett children slept comfortably in simple cotton nightclothes under a single wool blanket. Margaret worked at her sewing table, without her fingers going stiff from the cold. The air in the room remained completely dry, clean, and entirely free of pine smoke. Here's the thing. The true miracle of the subterranean chamber was not merely the high temperature. It was the absolute uniformity of the climate. In a standard log cabin above ground, even with a massive hearth fire roaring, there were always extreme cold zones. The corners of the room would hover near freezing, cold drafts would whistle across the floorboards, and the air near the glass windows would create a constant downdraft of chilled air. The underground chamber had 0 thermal zones. A thermometer placed in the exact center of the room read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. A thermometer placed in the far corner against the fieldstone wall read 62 degrees Fahrenheit as well. The stone walls acted like a giant thermal battery, radiating equal, gentle heat from every direction. There were no drafts, because there were no exterior walls exposed to the roaring mountain wind. There was no dampness, because the gravel subfloor drainage system carried away all ground moisture. There was no smoke, because the horizontal buried flue pipe created a steady, perfect thermal draft that pulled all combustion gases cleanly out behind the barn. Elizabeth, the 9-year-old eldest daughter, was the first to realize how different their life had become. "Mama," she whispered one evening as she sat at the wooden table, "I can actually read my book down here without my hands shaking." And she could. The steady room climate meant that the oil inside their tin lamps never thickened or gelled from the cold. The absence of drafty air currents meant the lamp flames burned clear, bright, and silent, without flickering. She sat in her light cotton dress, comfortably turning the pages of her schoolbook, while 3 miles away, children her exact age were huddled under piles of smelly bear hides in dark, freezing log cabins, too cold to do anything but shiver and wait for daylight. Yet from the outside world, nobody had any idea what was happening on the Garrett claim. To any neighbor riding past along the Snowy Valley Trail, Samuel's homestead looked quiet, humble, and completely unchanged. A small curl of smoke drifted lazily from his cabin chimney during the day. Samuel intentionally maintained a modest hearth fire in the cabin above ground to cook hot noon meals and maintain appearances. A second, nearly invisible plume of heat rose from the low flue pipe behind the snow-covered barn. The barn roof was piled high with drifted snow, the cabin windows were framed in white frost, and the homestead wore the exact same cold-beaten appearance as every other homestead in the territory. Then, 3 days after Christmas, on the morning of December 28th, Caleb Drummond rode his draft horse onto the Garrett property. Caleb had not planned to make a social visit in 25 below zero weather, but his young son Timothy had been expressing deep concern for the Garrett children. Timothy had noticed that he had not seen 9-year-old Elizabeth or 7-year-old William outside playing in the snow or hauling water buckets for over a week. There were no fresh boot tracks in the drifted snow between the cabin and the well. There was no heavy, dark smoke pouring from the main cabin chimney, except for brief periods around midday. To Caleb's eye, the Garrett place looked almost deserted, as if the family had abandoned the homestead or succumbed to the freezing cold. Caleb knew Samuel was alive. He had spotted him once or twice out by the barn doors, moving hay bales or carrying water buckets for his team of horses. But something about the quietness of the property felt deeply unsettling. In a Montana winter, this brutal survival required constant, aggressive human effort, men chopping wood incessantly, smoke billowing constantly from stone chimneys, the visible, desperate energy of families fighting for their lives against the freezing cold. The Garrett place was eerily quiet. Caleb dismounted his horse, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly through the snow crust that had lain frozen on the ground since late November. His breath formed thick clouds of white vapor that immediately froze into tiny icicles on his wool beard. He walked up to the front door of the main log cabin and knocked heavily with his gloved fist. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, shouting Samuel's name into the wind. Silence. Just as Caleb turned to walk back toward his horse, he heard a faint human voice echoing from inside the barn doors. "Caleb, is that you out there? Come around to the back of the barn." Caleb tramped through the deep snowdrifts around the rear corner of the barn building. He found Samuel standing near the back wall, wearing only a light wool coat, no scarf, and no heavy fur gloves. He was calmly adjusting the draft cap on a low 6-inch iron pipe that protruded barely 2 feet above the deep snow line. Caleb stared at his neighbor in absolute astonishment. "Sam, where in God's name is your family? My boy Timothy was convinced your kids had fallen sick or frozen." Samuel straightened up, brushed a dusting of dry snow from his coat sleeve, and offered a warm, relaxed smile. A genuine, easy smile that Caleb had not seen on any man's face since early October. "They are fine, Caleb," Samuel said calmly. "In fact, they are better than fine. Come inside the barn. I will show you." Samuel opened the heavy wooden barn door and ushered his shivering neighbor into the dim interior. The barn felt cold, filled with the sharp smell of dry hay, leather harness straps, and horses. Gaps between the wall planks let in narrow beams of pale winter light. It looked like any ordinary working barn on the frontier. Samuel walked to the center of the main floor alleyway, kicked aside a heavy pile of loose wheat straw, and grabbed an iron ring set flush into a heavy wooden trapdoor. "You actually dug that cellar you were talking about?" Caleb asked, peering over his shoulder. "You have your family living down in a dirt cellar?" "It is not a cellar, Caleb," Samuel replied softly. Samuel lifted the heavy pine trapdoor on its iron hinges. Immediately, a wave of thick, luxurious, warm air rose from the opening below. It was not stifling or hot, but it was noticeably, undeniably warmer than the freezing barn warmer, in fact, than any living room Caleb Drummond had set foot in for the past 3 months. Yellow oil lamp light flickered gently from the space below. Caleb could hear the distinct sound of children's laughter and the soft, steady hum of a woman singing a hymn. "Go on down, Caleb," Samuel said with a smile. "Take a look for yourself." Caleb Drummond slowly stepped onto the wooden ladder rungs, descending into the ground. Halfway down the ladder, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with utter shock. The subterranean chamber was clean, dry, and lit by 2 bright brass oil lamps hanging from the reinforced pine ceiling joists. The 4 walls were made of tightly fitted fieldstone, neatly mortared with clay. The floor was laid with flat, clean, limestone slabs. In the center of the room, a tiny, quiet fire burned inside a small fire-brick pit, sending its warm smoke through a buried horizontal pipe. Sitting around a sturdy pine table, looking as relaxed and comfortable as if it were a mild May afternoon, were Margaret Garrett and her 3 children. Elizabeth was sitting quietly, reading a hardcover schoolbook. William was carving a small wooden horse with his pocket knife. 4-year-old James was sitting directly on the stone floor, happily playing with a set of pine building blocks. Not a single person in the room was wearing a winter coat, heavy shawl, or wool mittens. Margaret wore a simple cotton house dress, with her sleeves rolled neatly up to her elbows as she kneaded bread dough in a large wooden bowl. The air in the room was not merely bearable, it was deeply, comfortably warm. Caleb stood at the base of the wooden ladder for a long, silent minute, trying to process what his eyes were seeing. His mind raced back to his own log cabin 3 miles down the valley. His 4 children were currently huddled under 3 layers of smelly horse blankets in a kitchen that smelled of wet pine smoke and hovered at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife's hands were raw, red, and swollen from working in freezing water. He had spent the last 3 weeks swinging a heavy axe in 30-below weather until his muscles burned, burning through 2 full cords of valuable firewood just to keep his family from freezing to death. And here, right beneath an ordinary barn floor, the Garrett family was living in total comfort, inside a stone room warmer than any house in the territory, burning nothing more than a handful of pine twigs in a tiny central pit. "My God, Sam," Caleb finally whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "How is this possible?" Samuel stepped down the ladder and stood beside him, explaining the physical mechanics clearly and plainly. He pointed out the subterranean baseline temperature of the deep earth, holding steady at 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. He explained the immense heat retention capacity of the stone walls and limestone floor. He showed Caleb the insulated ceiling joists, the 4-inch fresh air intake pipe with its hand-forged iron damper valve, and the buried horizontal flue pipe that extracted every ounce of heat from the fire smoke before venting outside. "How much firewood have you burned since you moved down here, Sam?" Caleb asked, leaning over to inspect the small fire pit. "Maybe a quarter of a cord," Samuel replied calmly. "We have been down here for 3 full weeks now." Caleb did the mental arithmetic in his head, and his jaw dropped. He had burned 8 times as much timber in the exact same time frame. 8 times the physical labor, 8 times the expense, 8 times the risk, and his own family was still shivering in their coats every single night. "The earth does most of the heavy lifting for us, Caleb," Samuel explained softly. The sim here never freezes. The walls stay at 54 degrees completely on their own. All I have to do is burn 3 or 4 small splits of wood in the morning to lift the air 10 degrees, and the stone floor holds that heat all day long. We let the fire die out completely before we go to sleep. By dawn, the room is still sitting at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret looked up from her bread dough and offered a gentle smile. "The children have not had a single cough or cold all month, Mr. Drummond. Last winter, James nearly died in our cabin. This winter, he plays on the stone floor in his bare feet." Caleb Drummond looked around the small stone chamber one last time. It was simple, unpretentious, and devoid of any luxury. There were no glass windows, no decorative wall paintings, no fancy carpets. It was constructed entirely from fieldstone, rough pine timber, gravel, and earth. But it worked. It worked with an absolute, undeniable perfection that shattered every assumption Caleb held about building a life on the American frontier. Caleb climbed slowly back up the wooden ladder, with Samuel following right behind him. They stood together in the cold, quiet barn, and Caleb looked at his neighbor with an expression that mixed deep awe with profound embarrassment. "Sam," Caleb said quietly, rubbing his cold face, "every single man in this valley thought you had lost your mind. I stood in the supply store 3 weeks ago and told Henry Walsh that you were going to cave your barn roof in and freeze your wife and children." Samuel chuckled softly, patting his neighbor's shoulder. "I heard what folks were saying, Caleb. It is all right. People only know what they have been taught." Caleb grabbed Samuel's arm, his eyes dead serious. "Sam, can I bring some men over here tomorrow? My brother-in-law is running out of dry wood. The Harrison family lost half their woodpile to ground rot last week. They need to see this with their own eyes. They need to understand how you built this." Samuel Garrett gave a firm, quiet nod. "Bring whoever needs to see it, Caleb. The door is open." By New Year's Day of 1888, the underground chamber beneath Samuel Garrett's barn had ceased to be a subject of local gossip and had transformed into something resembling a pilgrimage site for the entire valley. Word spread faster than the cold wind. What had started as a quiet whisper among a few immediate neighbors quickly swept through every homestead within 20 miles. Settlers who had spent the previous 6 months chuckling over Samuel's crazy digging project now tramped through knee-deep snowdrifts, shivering in their heavy sheepskin coats, eager to stand at the base of that wooden ladder and witness the miracle for themselves. Men arrived carrying mercury thermometers in their coat pockets, brass measuring tapes in their leather pouches, and small paper notebooks tucked under their arms. They were hard-headed frontier practicalists, farmers, ranchers, timber cutters, and trappers who did not care about theories or gossip. They cared about facts. They cared about numbers. And the numbers they recorded beneath Samuel's barn were cold, objective, and completely undeniable. Robert Finch, the master builder who had publicly mocked Samuel's underground design in October, returned on January 2nd. This time, Finch did not bring condescension. He brought a heavy brass-bound notebook and a spirit of intense scientific rigor. Finch was the kind of builder who trusted hard physical data over human opinion, and he conducted a methodical, step-by-step audit of the underground shelter. Finch spent 3 full hours measuring the chamber's exact physical dimensions: 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 6 feet subterranean depth. He measured the thickness of the dry-stacked fieldstone walls, carefully inspecting the 18-inch northern wall that faced the Arctic wind above ground. He crawled under the wooden floor joists to examine the clay, straw, and sawdust insulation layer. He traced the 4-inch fresh air intake pipe up through the wall, tested the hand-forged iron damper valve, and mapped the 8-foot horizontal flue pipe buried under the flat limestone floor slabs. Then, Finch began taking systematic temperature readings across the homestead. He recorded the ambient outside air temperature, 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He walked into Samuel's main log cabin above ground, where a fire was burning in the hearth, and recorded 46 degrees Fahrenheit. He recorded the temperature inside his own well-built log cabin down the road, where a cast-iron stove was burning, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Finally, Finch descended the ladder into the underground room beneath the barn. With only 3 small splits of pine burning in the brick central pit, the thermometer read a steady, comfortable 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. Someone in the small group of settlers standing in the barn above called down through the open trap door, "That thermometer of yours must be broken, Robert. There is no way a dirt hole is 20 degrees warmer than a log house with a roaring stove." Finch held the glass tube up to the yellow oil lamplight, inspecting the red liquid line closely. "I checked this instrument against the bank thermometer in Helena before I rode out here," Finch called back, his voice remarkably quiet. "It is dead accurate." Finch pulled out his pocket watch and sat at the pine table, recording temperature changes over time. He watched Samuel load the central fire pit with 3 small splits of pine wood, a total weight of roughly 8 pounds of wood. That modest fire burned quietly for 6 full hours, before Samuel added a single additional piece. During those 6 hours, while the mountain wind howled above ground and the outside temperature dropped 2 more degrees, the air temperature inside the subterranean chamber drifted down from 65 degrees Fahrenheit to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. A total temperature drop of merely 4 degrees over 6 full hours. Finch looked up from his notebook, staring around at the stone walls with a look of genuine awe. "I lose 4 degrees of heat in my log cabin in 40 minutes the moment my stove fire burns down," Finch declared to the men gathered in the room. "This stone room holds heat 15 times longer than a thick timber building." The mathematical implications hit every settler in the room like a heavy physical blow. That kind of unbelievable thermal stability meant an immediate, drastic reduction in physical labor. It meant not having to spend 4 hours every day swinging an axe in 30 below weather. It meant not having to wake up every 2 hours through the freezing night to stoke dying embers. It meant children sleeping peacefully through the dark hours without shivering under heavy bear hides. It meant a winter survival strategy that required a tiny fraction of the firewood that everyone else was burning through. Finch was far from finished with his analysis. He had spent the previous week collecting detailed fuel consumption logs from 24 different families across the valley, and now he laid out a comparative summary that would become legendary in local frontier history. From December 1st to December 28th, Finch announced, reading directly from his notes, The average family in this valley burned approximately 1½ cords of dry timber. Some burned more, some burned slightly less, depending on cabin size and how much cold they were willing to endure. In that exact same 4-week period, Samuel Garrett burned 1/3 of a single cord. Finch paused, letting the silence fill the stone room. 1/3 of a cord. That is 20% of the wood the rest of us burned. 1/5 of the fuel. For a family staying 10 degrees warmer than anyone else in this territory. The math spread through the valley faster than the blizzard itself. 20%, 1/5 of the wood. The news completely dismantled every traditional assumption about shelter building on the northern frontier. On January 3rd, Henry Walsh, the supply store owner who had made the cruel joke about Samuel digging his family's grave, rode his wagon out to the Garrett homestead. Walsh did not bring a thermometer, nor did he bring jokes. He brought a genuine, heartfelt apology. "I was dead wrong, Sam," Walsh said plainly, standing in the quiet barn. "I said foolish things because I was ignorant, and I am asking you today if you would be willing to come into town and teach our people how you engineered this thing. Because if this winter maintains this kind of brutal pace through February, half the families in this valley are going to run out of firewood before the spring thaw arrives." Samuel agreed without a moment's hesitation. He did not care about personal pride or proving his neighbors wrong. He cared about human lives. On the frontier, a winter storm did not discriminate between a builder and a fool, and Samuel knew that children across the valley were suffering in drafty cabins. Over the next 2 weeks, in a cleared corner of Walsh's general store that served as the settlement's informal community hall, Samuel held daily instruction sessions for local homesteaders. He brought a large slate chalkboard, drawing detailed construction diagrams with white chalk. Samuel broke down the underlying engineering principles into simple, practical steps that any working farmer could understand. He explained the subterranean thermal floor, how 6 feet of soil depth isolates a structure from surface air temperatures, providing a constant baseline of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of the blizzard above. He explained thermal mass, how heavy fieldstone and flat limestone slabs absorb heat slowly, store it densely, and radiate it back into a room for hours after a fire goes out. He walked them through the critical mechanics of ventilation, how a 4-inch fresh air intake pipe with an adjustable damper prevents air stagnation without dumping cold drafts onto the floor. He demonstrated the buried horizontal flue pipe, showing them how passing hot chimney smoke through 8 feet of subfloor masonry extracts 90% of the heat energy that normally escapes uselessly into the sky out a live, vertical chimney. The questions from the settlers were intense, urgent, and relentless. What about soil cave-ins, Sam? What about ground moisture seeping through the walls during a rain thaw? How do you keep smoke from backing up into the room when the wind shifts? How do you prevent bad air from making the kids sick? Samuel answered every single question with the calm, methodical patience of a man who had already solved each problem through hand excavation and real-world testing. "You do not need to be a professional miner to build this," Samuel told the crowd gathered at the store. "You do not need to dig 20 feet deep. 6 feet gets your floor below the frost line, and that is where the thermal baseline sits. You do not need expensive imported firebrick, packed clay mortar, and native river granite work, just as well if you stack them right. You do not even need a buried horizontal flue if you cannot forge the iron pipe. A standard vertical brick chimney will still work. You will just lose some fuel efficiency. The absolute secret is getting below the frost line, insulating your ceiling with clay and sawdust, and surrounding your living space with stone mass." By mid-January of 1888, the true test of Samuel Garrett's design arrived in the form of a historic, apocalyptic Arctic disaster. It began on the morning of January 12th. The meteorological event, which would go down in American history as the horrific children's blizzard, hit the northern plains and mountain territories with terrifying, unexpected ferocity. The air temperature did not merely drop. It plummeted like a stone off a cliff. In less than 3 hours, the temperature across the valley plunged 40 degrees, dropping to 30 below zero, 40 below zero, and eventually reaching an agonizing 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Accompanying the brutal freeze was a screaming 50-mile-per-hour gale-force wind that drove powder snow so dense that a man could not see his own hand held 6 inches from his face. The Great Blizzard of 1888 locked the territory in a vice-like grip for 4 solid days. Above ground, the valley turned into a frozen nightmare. Log cabins groaned under the immense wind pressure. Chimneys cracked and blew down under 60-mile-per-hour gusts. The extreme cold turned solid pine logs so brittle that they snapped like dry glass when struck by the wind. Families were trapped inside their homes, desperately feeding their iron stoves every single hour as the cold crept through every log seam. Down the road, the McAllister family ran out of split wood on the second night of the storm. Mr. McAllister was forced to chop up his own wooden dining chairs and barn fence rails inside his kitchen, just to keep his children's bedroom above freezing. At the Harrison homestead, the intense frost drove through their mud chinking, coating the inside of their living room walls with 2 inches of solid white ice. Livestock froze, standing up in their wooden pens across the territory. Yet inside the subterranean stone chamber beneath Samuel Garrett's barn, the blizzard of 1888 did not exist. On the third night of the storm, as 50-below winds screamed across the barn roof overhead, Caleb Drummond and his brother-in-law, whose own cabin stove had cracked under the extreme heat, made a desperate run through the snowdrifts to take shelter at the Garrett place. Caleb lifted the heavy barn trapdoor, descended the wooden ladder, and stepped out of a screaming sub-zero hellscape directly into a paradise of radiant heat. The contrast was staggering. Outside, the world was 50 degrees below zero with a 50-mile-per-hour wind chill that could freeze exposed human skin in less than 30 seconds. Inside the subterranean room, the air was a soft, steady, incredible 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Samuel Garrett was sitting at the wooden table in his short-sleeved cotton shirt, calmly sipping a cup of hot black tea. Margaret was sitting on a bench, sewing a wool quilt. The 3 children were fast asleep on their limestone floor pallets, tucked under thin cotton sheets, breathing deeply and peacefully. The small fire pit in the center of the room contained only a few glowing embers of dry pine. The buried horizontal flue pipe was radiating gentle, consistent warmth upward through the limestone floor slabs. The 4-inch fresh air intake pipe was quietly supplying clean, crisp oxygen, while the iron damper valve kept out every drop of the roaring mountain gale. Caleb Drummond stood at the base of the ladder, his face caked in ice, his fingers numb inside his leather mittens, staring at his neighbor in absolute speechless wonder. He had just walked out of an Arctic death trap above ground and stepped into a room that felt like a mild afternoon in May. "Sam," Caleb stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the radiant stone heat hit his frozen skin. "It is 50 below zero up there. The wind is tearing the roofs off the hay sheds." Samuel stood up, walked over to his neighbor, and helped him pull off his frozen coat. "I know, Caleb," Samuel said gently, handing him a warm cup of tea. "Sit down by the stone floor. It is 55 degrees underground, no matter what the sky decides to do." By the time the Great Blizzard finally broke on January 16th, 3 different families who had adopted Samuel's underground principles during the early winter thaws emerged from their own subterranean shelters, completely unscathed. The McAllister family had excavated a quick 7-foot pit directly under their kitchen floorboards 3 weeks prior, lining the earth walls with heavy timber beams and packed clay. They had survived the 50-below storm in total warmth, burning less than 1/10 of the wood their neighbors had consumed. The Donovan brothers, who shared a homestead 2 miles north, had constructed a larger communal subterranean chamber between their 2 log cabins, connecting the space with short, earth-insulated tunnels. They had housed 11 people, including 3 young infants, through the 4-day blizzard without a single person suffering so much as a minor chill. And the Patterson family, whose young daughter had been suffering from a dangerous chest cough in December, had moved her down into a small stone-lined chamber excavated beneath their existing root cellar. By the time the blizzard ended, her cough was completely gone, her lungs were clear, and she was playing happily on the warm stone floor. The adaptations proved a profound historical point. This was not merely the lucky experiment of one eccentric former copper miner. It was a universal, scalable principle of physical science, a masterclass in thermal mass, subsurface baseline insulation, and radiant heat engineering that could be adapted, scaled, and built by any hardworking family on the frontier. Margaret Garrett stood in the warm underground room as the January sun finally broke through the clouds above ground. Women who had pitied her 2 months earlier now came to her room to learn how she managed her household beneath the earth. Children who had been dangerously sick all autumn were now healthy, strong, and thriving. The valley had been forced to face a brutal choice between traditional habit and physical reality. And in choosing reality, they had learned how to thrive in one of the most unforgiving climates on the American continent. Samuel Garrett, the man they had once called crazy, stood in his barn alleyway, looking down through the open trap door at his sleeping children. He did not seek praise, and he did not ask for credit. He was simply a working man who had respected the physics of the earth, and in doing so, had kept his family safe from the mountain storm. By the time the spring thaw finally swept across the Montana Territory in April of 1888, the valley looked back on the winter that had just passed with a mixture of profound relief and quiet awe. The Great Blizzard of 1888 had gone down in history as one of the most destructive Arctic events ever recorded on the American continent. Livestock losses across the territory were catastrophic. Traditional timber cabins had suffered severe structural damage, and families who had relied strictly on conventional, above-ground heating had burned through every single stick of wood they possessed, often forced to burn furniture and fence rails just to survive. Yet, on the Garrett homestead, and on the 4 neighboring claims that had built subterranean shelters, based on Samuel's design, the winter had been an unprecedented victory of human ingenuity over brute nature. Not a single member of the Garrett family had fallen ill. Little James, who had nearly died of a lung infection the previous spring, had spent the entire winter playing happily on a dry limestone floor that stayed at a steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret had completed her winter mending in a room that required no heavy coats or fur blankets, and Samuel had emerged into the spring sunshine, rested, healthy, and with over 80% of his woodpile completely untouched. As the mountain trails cleared of snow, news of Samuel Garrett's subterranean barn shelter spread far beyond the borders of their small Montana valley. Trappers riding south to Helena, supply freighters traveling west to Butte, and territorial newspaper editors all carried the story of the former copper miner who had beaten a 50-below Arctic blizzard using nothing more than fieldstone, earth depth, and basic physical science. During the summer of 1888, Robert Finch, the master builder who had once dismissed underground shelter as a foolish dirt pit, completely changed his approach to frontier construction. Finch began offering a new service to homesteaders settling across the territory: integrated subterranean living chambers built directly beneath barn floors and kitchen foundations. Finch did not hide where he had learned the design. He openly credited Samuel Garrett, using Samuel's hand-drawn slate diagrams to show new settlers how 6 feet of dirt depth provided an unbreakable 55-degree thermal floor, how flat limestone floor slabs provided immense thermal mass storage, and how a buried horizontal flue pipe converted waste smoke heat into radiant floor warmth. By the autumn of 1888, over 30 new subterranean shelters were excavated across the valley. Some were built under barns like Samuel's. Others were built beneath kitchen floors or root cellars. But every single one of them operated on the exact same principles of subterranean physics that Samuel had observed during his decade in the Butte copper mines. When the historical numbers were fully calculated by local builders and recorded in territorial timber logs, the comparative data was astonishing. During a standard 4-month Montana winter, a traditional log cabin built above ground consumed between 12 and 15 cords of hard pine wood. The family living inside that cabin was forced to endure constant temperature swings, plunging to 40 degrees inside during the freezing night, rising to 60 near the iron stove, and dropping back to freezing near the window glass. To harvest those 15 cords of timber, a homesteading father had to spend over 300 hours of grueling physical labor, swinging a heavy axe, hauling timber with horse wagons, and splitting heavy logs in freezing weather. In contrast, Samuel Garrett's subterranean stone chamber consumed exactly 3 cords of wood for the entire winter, an unprecedented savings of over 80% in fuel. Let those figures settle in your mind. 3 cords of wood instead of 15. 60 hours of physical harvesting labor instead of 300. And instead of enduring drafty, 40-degree living quarters, with ice forming in the wash basin every night, the Garrett family enjoyed a steady, uniform room climate of 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 hours a day, regardless of whether the outside world was 10 above zero or 50 below zero. The math did not lie. It was not luck. It was not magic. It was the absolute, unyielding application of physical science. Truth be told, the story of Samuel Garrett contains a profound lesson for anyone interested in off-grid survival, homesteading, and self-reliance today. For generations, traditional builders had fought against winter using sheer, unyielding brute force. They built bigger log walls, chopped larger wood piles, installed larger iron stoves, and burned through millions of tons of timber trying desperately to force a drafty wooden box above ground to stay warm in an 80-degree temperature battle against the Arctic sky. Samuel Garrett did something far smarter. He stopped fighting nature and started leveraging its underlying laws. He understood that human beings do not need to invent new energy sources if they simply learn how to cooperate with the massive thermal systems already built into the earth beneath their boots. By stepping 6 feet below the frost line, Samuel did not escape winter by hiding from it. He bypassed winter entirely by entering a subterranean universe that the cold wind could never reach. He took advantage of the Earth's natural baseline temperature, used fieldstone and clay to store radiant heat, and built a simple, comfortable shelter that kept his family warm, healthy, and safe when the rest of the territory was freezing. If you found value, inspiration, or practical knowledge in this historical breakdown today, please hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with anyone you know who loves history, off-grid living, DIY building, or traditional survival wisdom. And do not forget to leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were in Samuel Garrett's boots in 1887. We read every single comment, and your support is what allows us to keep bringing these incredible historical engineering stories to life. Until next time, stay curious, respect the wisdom of the past, and remember that sometimes the most brilliant solutions are sitting right beneath our feet.